She died and came back screaming a warning from Jesus. For a moment she was gone, her heart stopped, her body lifeless. But what she saw on the other side changed everything. She didn't see a peaceful light. She wasn't welcomed into paradise. Instead, she was dragged into darkness. She saw the faces of those who begged to enter heaven and were denied. She watched as names vanished from the book of life. And she was given a terrifying mission: warn them before it's too late. What she experienced will leave you shaken. This isn't just another near-death story. This is a warning, a message straight from the afterlife. And whether you believe or not, you need to hear this. Stay until the end, because what she reveals will change the way you see everything. Before we begin, if you're watching this, it's not an accident. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss messages like this. Most people who watch aren't subscribed, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now let's get into it. For as long as she could remember, she'd dismissed anything that had to do with religion or spirituality. God, heaven, hell, all just myths to her, stories told to make people feel better about the unknown. Life was meant to be lived in the here and now, not wasted on thoughts of eternity. She prided herself on being logical, rooted in science, and found comfort in her circle of friends, school achievements, and social media. Likes, comments, and reposts were the currency of her self-worth, and faith was a subject she avoided entirely. Her days were filled with the tangible, studying for exams, laughing over inside jokes, and carefully curating her online persona. The idea of an afterlife seemed like a distraction from reality, something old-fashioned people used to explain the mysteries of life. She found peace in not thinking too deeply about what happened after death. Besides, she was too young to worry about it, right? There was too much life left to live, too many experiences waiting for her. Whenever someone mentioned God or faith, she'd roll her eyes and dismiss it as foolishness. Religion was just a crutch for the weak, she thought. It was something she'd debated about online, tearing apart arguments with logic and skepticism. She couldn't understand how anyone could believe in something they couldn't see or touch. To her, faith felt like living with blinders on, and she vowed never to be that naive. Deep down, though, there was a subtle, gnawing fear, one she buried beneath layers of distraction. Late at night, when the world was quiet, an uncomfortable question sometimes crept into her mind: what if I'm wrong? She'd quickly push the thought away, drowning it in music or social media until it faded. But the unease remained, lurking just beneath the surface. She believed she had all the time in the world to figure things out. There was no rush, no reason to dwell on something as abstract as eternity. Life was short, and she intended to make the most of it. Little did she know that mindset was about to be shattered in the most terrifying and life-altering way imaginable. It happened in an instant. 1 second, she was scrolling through her phone, half listening to the sound of the crosswalk signal, and the next, a blinding force struck her body like a wrecking ball. The impact was deafening, a sickening crunch of metal and bone, the screech of brakes too late to stop what had already been set in motion. The world flipped, twisted, and then nothing. She felt no pain, no sensation at all, in fact, just a strange, weightless detachment, like waking up from a deep sleep, but not quite being awake. Then she saw it. Her body, motionless, crumpled on the pavement like a discarded rag doll. A crowd had already gathered, their faces contorted in horror. Someone screamed. Another voice frantically called for help, but she wasn't down there. She was above it all, looking down, floating in the thick, humid air like an untethered balloon. Her mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream, a hallucination? She tried to move, but there was nothing to move. No arms, no legs, just a presence and awareness. A terrible, sinking realization settled in. She wasn't in her body anymore. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their voices urgent yet distant, as though muffled by an invisible barrier. "No pulse!" one of them shouted. The words should have terrified her, but she felt nothing. just an eerie calm, an unnatural stillness. She should be panicking, fighting to wake up, but something about this moment felt permanent. Then the air around her shifted. A strange, creeping sensation prickled at what she could only describe as her soul. The atmosphere thickened, darkened, as if the light itself was being drained away. And just as she began to wonder what would happen next, she felt it. Something pulling her, dragging her downward into a suffocating abyss. At first, it felt like a slow descent, as though she were being pulled by an invisible current beneath her. The city sounds, the sirens, the frantic voices faded into a distant until there was only silence. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but oppressive, thick and unnatural. The weight of it pressed against her, and for the first time, fear clawed its way into her chest. Then the descent quickened. What had felt like drifting suddenly became plummeting. She was falling, no, being dragged downward into an abyss blacker than anything she had ever seen. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was an all-consuming void, a suffocating nothingness that swallowed every shred of warmth and comfort. She tried to scream, but there was no voice, no breath, no body, only the sheer terror of knowing she was slipping into something beyond human comprehension. Then came the whispers, soft at first, like wind rustling through dead leaves. Then clearer, sibilant voices murmuring her name from all directions. The whispers weren't comforting, they weren't familiar, they were wrong, twisted, and as they grew louder she realized they were laughing, mocking, enjoying her fear. Shadowy figures slithered at the edges of the darkness, moving unnaturally fast, shifting in and out of form. Shapes that were there and then not, as if the void itself was alive, watching her, waiting. She felt exposed, like prey cornered by unseen predators. The whispers became voices, taunting, accusing, reminding her of every selfish act, every cruel word, every moment she had denied the existence of anything beyond herself. She tried to fight, to resist whatever force was pulling her deeper, but there was nothing to grasp, no way to climb back up. The deeper she fell, the colder it became, not just a physical cold, but a spiritual one, a hollowness that gnawed at the edges of her very being. And then a realization struck her with more force than the truck had. I don't belong here, but I have no way out. The darkness wasn't just a place, it was alive. It pressed against her, suffocating, seeping into every part of her existence. The whispers had turned into hissing, and now from the shadows they emerged. Eyes, countless gleaming eyes blinking open in the void, watching her with a hunger that sent ice through her soul. The figures moved closer, their forms shifting, sometimes human, sometimes monstrous, always wrong. They were twisted, unnatural, as if they had been human once, but had been corrupted beyond recognition. Their mouths curled into grotesque smiles, revealing jagged, unnatural teeth. One reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against her. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever known, an invasion into the very core of her being. It wasn't just touching her, it was claiming her. A sickening wave of despair crashed over her as she realized what they wanted. They weren't just there to scare her, they were waiting for her. She was theirs. Voices grew deafening. They whispered things she didn't understand, but she felt the meaning. Every doubt, every sin, every time she had mocked the idea of God or an afterlife, it was being used against her. These things knew her better than she knew herself. She tried to run, but where? There was no ground, no air, no sense of direction, only them closing in, ready to drag her into something far worse than this void. One of them leaned in close, its breath like rotting flesh, and whispered in a voice that sounded like it came from deep inside her own mind. You never believed, and now you never leave. Terror consumed her. She had never prayed before, never called out to a God she didn't believe in. But now, with every fiber of her being, she screamed, not with her mouth, but with her soul. That's when the light exploded. The darkness recoiled. It happened so suddenly, so violently, that the creatures around her shrieked in agony. A force unlike anything she had ever known blasted through the abyss, tearing through the suffocating void with a brilliance so intense it was almost blinding. For the first time since she had been dragged into this nightmare, she felt something other than terror, something powerful, overwhelming, unstoppable. The light wasn't just light. It carried a presence, a force that sent the shadows scattering like insects exposed to the sun. It was authority. It was holiness. The beings that had taunted her moments ago now cowered, their screeches filling the air like nails on a chalkboard. She felt the grip they had on her weaken, their twisted fingers unraveling as if burned by an invisible fire. Then, before she could process what was happening, she felt it, something reaching for her. It wasn't like the cold, grasping hands of the entities. This was different. This touch was warm, strong, familiar in a way she couldn't explain. It pulled her upward with a force that defied everything, lifting her out of the abyss with a speed so great that the darkness vanished below her in an instant. She didn't look back. She couldn't look back. The warmth surrounded her, filled her, driving out every ounce of fear that had consumed her moments before. The higher she rose, the more the darkness faded until all that remained was the light, endless, radiant, and alive. And then, in the center of it all, she saw him. She didn't need an introduction. She knew who he was the moment she saw him. There, standing in the center of the overwhelming radiance, was Jesus Christ. But he wasn't like the soft, glowing figure she had seen in paintings. He wasn't fragile. He wasn't distant. He was more real than anything she had ever known. His presence was unlike anything she had ever felt, commanding yet compassionate, powerful yet deeply sorrowful. His eyes, piercing and full of authority, locked onto hers, and in that instant she understood everything. There was no need for words. He saw all of her, the life she had lived, the choices she had made, the moments she had turned away from the truth. And yet there was no hatred in his gaze, no anger, only a sorrow so deep it made her soul ache. Tears streamed down her face, though she wasn't sure she even had a body in this place. She wanted to fall to her knees, to hide from the unbearable weight of truth radiating from him, but she couldn't move. It wasn't fear that paralyzed her. It was the sheer magnitude of his presence. She had spent her entire life denying him, dismissing him, arguing against him. And now, standing before him, she realized the terrible mistake she had made. She wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for another chance, but no words came out. Jesus didn't need her words. He already knew. His expression remained sorrowful, as if he had been waiting for her to see what had been true all along. And then, without moving his lips, she heard him. "I never stopped loving you." A sob racked through her soul. The weight of those words crushed her, not because they hurt, but because they healed. She had been so wrong about everything, and she was about to see just how much. Before she could process what was happening, the space around her shifted. It was as if time itself folded inward, and suddenly she was watching her own life play out before her, every moment, every thought, every decision. But this wasn't like remembering a memory. She wasn't just seeing it, she was feeling it. She saw herself as a child, carefree, full of wonder, before the doubts crept in. Then came the teenage years. The moments when she had laughed at people of faith, rolling her eyes at prayers and dismissing any talk of God as nonsense. Every time she had scrolled past a message about Jesus, every time she had ignored that small, nagging feeling in the back of her mind, she felt it all now. But it wasn't just her actions that played before her, it was their impact. She watched scenes she barely remembered, moments that had seemed insignificant at the time, now revealing ripple effects she had never considered. The harsh words she had spoken in anger, the people she had hurt, the opportunities she had ignored to show kindness. All of it mattered in ways she had never realized. And then came the most painful part. She saw every time God had reached out to her. Every close call, every gentle nudge, every moment of conviction that she had brushed aside. The friend who had invited her to church. The stranger who had mentioned Jesus at just the right time. The late-night thoughts that had whispered, "What if you're wrong?" She had always thought she was in control of her own life, but now she saw the truth. God had been pursuing her all along, and she had rejected him. Tears blurred her vision. She turned to Jesus, her soul trembling. "I didn't know," she wanted to say, but the moment the thought crossed her mind, she realized the truth. "I did know, I just didn't want to believe." Jesus' face was filled with sorrow, but not condemnation. There was no hatred in his gaze, only the unbearable sadness of a love that had been offered and refused. She had spent her entire life running from the truth, and now, standing before him, she finally understood. She had been given the gift of choice, and she had chosen wrong. Just as she thought her life review was over, the scene around her changed. The past faded, and in its place, a new vision unfolded. One that wasn't a memory, but something else entirely. She was being shown something. Before her, the world stretched out in eerie silence, but something was wrong. The sky was darker, the air thick with an unseen heaviness. Cities bustled with life, people going about their daily routines, laughing, working, living as if nothing was wrong. But as she looked closer, she saw what they couldn't. A darkness slithered beneath the surface, just out of sight. She saw people with empty eyes, smiling while being unknowingly led. Behind them, shadowy figures moved, whispering, guiding, manipulating. These weren't ordinary people. These were demonic forces, masquerading as truth, as progress, as safety, and the world followed blindly. Then she saw something that sent a chill through her soul. A great gathering of people, standing before a leader whose face she couldn't see. The crowd cheered, worshipped, obeyed without question. But behind this figure, she saw what they couldn't, an abyss darker than the one she'd been pulled from. It fed on them, drawing them in without them even realizing it. She wanted to scream, to warn them. "Don't you see what's happening?" But no one heard her. They laughed, they clapped, they marched forward, unaware of where they were being led. And then, in an instant, the vision shattered. She was back in the presence of Jesus. Her soul trembled, overwhelmed with what she had just seen. She didn't understand everything, but she knew this. The world was being deceived. People were walking blindly into darkness, convinced they were safe, and time was running out. Jesus looked at her with an intensity that burned into the deepest part of her soul. She didn't need words to understand what he was telling her. Go back, warn them. After the prophetic vision faded, she became aware of a massive structure before her, a set of towering gates, so radiant they seemed woven from pure light. Instinctively, she knew what this was, the gates of heaven. A place she had never believed in, now standing right before her. But something was wrong. She heard voices, desperate, pleading voices echoing from beyond the gates. She turned and saw them. Countless people, their faces twisted in anguish, pounding on the closed doors. "Lord, open to us," they cried. Their voices were filled with terror, their hands reaching, but the gates did not move. Then a voice from within the gates answered. It was firm, full of sorrow, yet unyielding. "I never knew you. Depart from me." The words struck like a hammer, final and absolute. The people outside the gates wailed, their cries piercing through the air. Some fell to their knees, sobbing. Others screamed in disbelief. "But we believed in you. We went to church, we did good things." Yet the gates remained closed. A horrifying realization gripped her. These weren't people who had never heard the truth. These were people who thought they were safe. People who had gone through the motions of faith but never truly followed Jesus. They had lived as though they had all the time in the world, only to discover, too late, that eternity had already begun. Tears welled in her eyes. She had lived her life thinking none of this mattered. Now she saw how wrong she had been. Jesus' voice spoke again, not in anger, but in sorrow. Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven." And then she was taken somewhere else, somewhere even more terrifying. As the scene shifted, she found herself standing in a vast open space. Before her was a massive glowing book, so brilliant that its pages seemed woven from living light. She didn't need anyone to explain what it was. She knew this was the book of life. She watched as names glowed across its pages, shimmering like golden fire. But then, to her horror, some of those names began to fade. One by one, the letters blurred, dimmed, and then vanished completely, as if they had never been written at all. She gasped. These weren't just random names. These were people who had once believed, once followed Jesus. But somewhere along the way, they had turned back. They had chosen the world over him. A deep sorrow filled her as she realized what she was witnessing. These were people who had known the truth but had become lukewarm, distracted, or deceived. People who had assumed they were safe, yet their names were being erased. She turned to Jesus, her heart pounding. "What does this mean?" she wanted to ask. But before she could, the pages of the book flipped violently, and she saw something that made her knees go weak. There were names missing. Entire sections where names should have been, but the spaces were blank. People who had never accepted him at all. People who had spent their lives rejecting him, ignoring every chance to turn back. The weight of what she was seeing crushed her. She had spent her life thinking eternity wasn't real, that faith was just a personal choice with no real consequences. Now she saw the terrifying truth. Eternity was not a game. Salvation was not automatic, and time was running out. The book snapped shut, and instantly she was taken somewhere else. The atmosphere around her shifted again. A mighty presence filled the space, and she turned to see a being unlike anything she had ever imagined. It was an angel, towering, radiant, clothed in a brilliance that pulsed with authority. Its very presence made her soul tremble. Not in fear, but in sheer awe. When the angel spoke, its voice wasn't just heard, it resonated through every fiber of her being. Judgment is coming. Many will be lost. The words struck like thunder, final and absolute. There was no hesitation, no sugarcoating, just truth. She wanted to argue, to ask why so many would be lost. But before she could speak, visions flashed before her. She saw the world as it was now, people laughing, scrolling on their phones, arguing over meaningless things, completely unaware of what was coming. She saw churches filled with people who thought they were safe, but were spiritually asleep. She saw believers compromising, choosing comfort over truth, unknowingly drifting further from God. And then she saw the enemy's deception. He wasn't working through obvious evil. He was working through distraction, complacency, twisting truth into something unrecognizable. The world was being lulled into a false sense of security while the clock was running out. The angel looked at her, its eyes burning with urgency. They do not see, they do not listen, they do not believe. Tears welled in her eyes. The weight of those words crushed her. She had been one of them. She had ignored every warning, dismissed every sign. But you must tell them. She felt her soul tremble. This wasn't just a vision. This was a command. Then, in an instant, she was pulled away and everything changed again. The overwhelming brilliance of the angel's presence faded, and suddenly she felt herself falling. Not into darkness this time, but back toward the world she had left behind. The weight of her body returned, heavy and unfamiliar. The distant beeping of machines grew louder, the voices of nurses and doctors snapping into focus. Her eyes shot open. Pain flooded her senses. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital burned into her vision. She gasped, her chest rising and falling with desperate breaths. The heart monitor beeped frantically. Nurses rushed to her bedside, shouting for the doctor. She had returned, but something was different. She wasn't the same person who had been hit by that truck. She had stood before Jesus. She had seen the horror of being separated from him. She had witnessed the truth of eternity, and now she was back. Not because because she wanted to be, but because she had been sent. Tell them before it's too late. The words rang in her soul like a command branded into her very existence. But how could she possibly explain what she had seen? How could she make people believe? Her family stood around her, eyes wide with shock. Tears streamed down their faces. "We thought we lost you," her mother whispered. "You weren't breathing. Your heart stopped. They said it was over." She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. How could she even begin to describe what she had experienced? Would they even listen? Would anyone believe her? The weight of the mission pressed heavily on her chest. She had been given a second chance. But second chances came with responsibility, and she would soon learn. The forces that had tried to claim her weren't finished with her yet. The first few nights back were the worst. She thought returning to life would bring relief, but instead, it felt like she had brought something back with her. Something dark that did not want her to speak. The first time it happened, she was lying in her hospital bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. As soon as she closed her eyes, an overwhelming pressure crushed down on her chest. Her body froze. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if an unseen force was pinning her to the bed. Then came the whispers, low, guttural, seething with hatred. "Stay silent." Her heart pounded in terror. She tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. The room around her felt darker, heavier, as if something unseen lurked in the corners watching. She fought with everything in her, forcing her lips to move. A single word escaped in a hoarse whisper: "Jesus." The moment his name left her lips, the darkness recoiled. The pressure lifted, the whispers vanished. She gasped for air, tears streaming down her face, but it didn't stop there. Night after night, the attacks continued. Shadows flickered in the corners of her room. Whispers invaded her dreams. A constant presence loomed over her, attempting to paralyze her with fear. And every time she tried to share her experience, something would interfere. Calls would drop, voices would distort, distractions would pull people away. The message was clear. They did not want her to speak. But she had already made her choice. No matter what came against her, she would warn them, because now she understood this battle was real. She takes a deep breath, staring into the camera. The weight of everything she has seen, everything she has lived, sits heavy on her heart, but she has to speak. "This is real," she says, her voice trembling but firm. "Hell is real, and most people have no idea what's coming." She looks directly at the viewer, her eyes pleading. "I was one of you. I didn't believe. I laughed at people who talked about God. I thought none of it mattered, and I almost paid the price for that mistake." She grips the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "I saw the ones who thought they were safe, the ones who begged at the gates of heaven but were turned away. I saw names disappearing from the book of life. I heard the angel declare that judgment is coming, and most people don't even realize it." Her voice sharpens. "You don't have time to keep ignoring this. You don't have time to keep waiting for someday to get right with God. Because someday might not come." A tear slips down her cheek. "I was given a second chance, but most people won't. Don't be one of them." She leans in closer. If you're watching this, it's not an accident. You have a choice. Right now. Then the final plea. If you don't know Jesus, seek him. If you've turned away, come back. Because the clock is running out. She exhales shakily, then looks straight at the audience. She came back for a reason, and now the message is in your hands. What if this was your last warning? What if you don't get another chance? She saw the truth. Most people are not ready. They think they have time, but they don't. They think they're safe, but they're not. So I'm asking you, are you ready? Do you believe her story? Or do you think it was just a hallucination? Let me know in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And if this shook you, share it. Someone who needs to hear this before it's too late. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on, because in the next video, we're diving even deeper into the truth about the afterlife. And trust me, you don't want to miss it. I'll see you in the next one.